Hi, I'm Moji Alawodeyal from the Feminist Buzzkills Live Pod, the only podcast that helps you navigate the news in this post-pro anti-abortion hellscape. Each week, with co-host Liz Winstead, we dissect all the news from that sketchy intersection of abortion and misogyny with providers and activists working on the ground. The cherry on top is we have amazing comedy guests who help us laugh through the rage. Feminist Buzzkills Live drops Fridays wherever you pod. Listen and subscribe, because when BS is popping, we pop off.
Hello, Truth Seekers, and welcome to this week's episode of UnSpun. This may be a familiar story to you. You've been active in an online political group, maybe for years. Maybe it's Pantsuit Nation, maybe it's Classy Conservatives. You've shared some thoughtful posts with other people, maybe even helped someone's GoFundMe, defended the group in outside conversations when other people have mocked it. And the people there have seen you as, one of the good ones. But one afternoon, someone posts an article criticizing a piece of policy that people in there care a lot about. And it's really emotional, and you agree with 95% of it. But maybe you write a comment suggesting, just one little sentence that says a small compromise might help get more public support, and you post it. And the replies come crashing in. Wow, masks off with you. And the next, troll detected. And it kind of goes downhill from there. Within an hour, someone's found an old comment of yours that they say proves you were never really one of us. The mods maybe message you about undermining the cause, and you wake up the next morning banned. It's years of connection and they're gone. And it's not because you flipped to the opposition, but because you didn't pass a purity test. Now freeze that image and we're going to jump back in time because this is not a new issue. We got the same human impulses, but we've got different stakes. And I'm talking about Rwanda in the mid-1990s. There had been horrific mass violence, and the regime that ended up in power was trying to increase their control. There were speeches and there were radio addresses about purifying the nation. So what's pure? There's no formal list, but everyone starts to understand that the definition of pure is whatever the people in power say it is this week. Maybe a neighbor gets accused of consorting with enemy sympathizers, and a cousin stops attending meetings just in case. And asking questions about policy in public forums is just a way of destroying yourself. So one story lives in a corner of the internet and the other in the, workings of a state, but underneath it's really the same thing. They both use the idea of ideological purity to decide who belongs and who does not. It's a fear of contamination, right? Moral contamination, ideological, cultural, and that serves to keep people in line. And it can really be devastating. That's what we're getting into today. And I've got 3 goals for you. We're going to look at how purity appeals have been used already. And it's a story that crosses time and place, and really we see it a lot. And second, we're going to learn about wedge issues, which is a way of exploiting what people care about the most. Bad actors use these wedge issues to create the pretext for those purity tests so that they can consolidate power. And finally, we're going to look at the changed media landscape and how that makes this strategy easier and more rewarding. In other words, it's going to be used a lot, and it's up to us to make sure that it doesn't work. Sound good? Let's get unspun. Now, it may sound like fancy words, but the main idea of ideological purity testing is simple. It's a loyalty check. There's others, right? So it might be a leader speaking on a news show or a crowd online. They demand that people endorse a set of ideas fully. No exceptions, no reservations, or else there's going to be consequences. So in politics, that might mean refusing to endorse candidates who disagree, even on a single issue. In activist circles, it can mean being canceled if you point out that an issue has nuances. And online, it might show up as hashtags like not a real whatever, or, mean memes or coordinated callouts. And this isn't new, right? Groups have always had boundaries, but ideological purity takes it a whole lot further. It's about drawing the boundary as finely as you can, because the narrower the boundary, the harder it is to pass the test. And that means that the people who control the definitions, those influencers, have a lot of power. When I say purity, it's a particular definition. It's a rightness of what you believe. Purity kind of framed as an opposition to pollution. You'll hear things like people who think this contaminate our movement, or they've been tainted by these other people, or this person's clean, they're one of us. And you might already be thinking, yeah, but we do need to know who's on our side. And that's true, movements need trust. But a purity test isn't about verifying trust in a healthy way. It's instead using that trust as a weapon to shape the boundaries of who matters and who doesn't. And years of research have shown that this is not a fringe tactic. It's a regular feature of politics, religion, and even science. Manipulators use these purity appeals to create in groups and outgroups with what feels like big consequences for people who step out of line. Let's walk through a couple of examples. In the late 2010s, Hungarian Prime Minister Viktor Orban ramped up his illiberal democracy platform. He used this term, illiberal democracy, notably in a speech in 2014, and has since continued to articulate kind of a vision of Hungary as an illiberal state. And this is a system where elections happen, but liberal institutions, such as independent courts and media, become weak in order to prioritize what it is that the majority wants. He framed EU critics and domestic opposition parties as agents of Brussels, right? So outsiders bent on polluting Hungary's values and culture. And in 2017, the Hungarian government launched a billboard campaign featuring George Soros, portraying him as influencing EU migration policies in a way that threatened Hungary's national purity by trying to just flood the country with migrants. Questioning Orban's anti-migration policies became, in effect, questioning whether you were truly loyal to being Hungarian. It's an ideological purity test dressed in ethnic and cultural clothing. Now, during his presidency, Donald Trump regularly uses the term Republicans in name only, or RINO, to ostracize party members who don't fully endorse his positions. And sometimes these members are deeply conservative. So, for example, in 2021, Representative Liz Cheney was stripped of her House GOP leadership role after her work on a House committee investigating the January 6th attack on the U.S. Capitol. And it wasn't about long-term conservative credentials. Cheney is deeply conservative, but about her failure to show loyalty to the president. Political scientists and analysts note that under Trump's influence, loyalty to him has become a primary defining factor for being considered a true conservative in the party, according to NPR. And down in South America, Hugo Chavez built a powerful loyalty structure through his Bolivarian Revolution. His political opponents were labeled escualidos, the squalid ones, suggesting that they were morally and politically contaminated. State media talked about this division every day, and public servants weren't expected just to vote for Chavez, but also had to participate publicly in pro-governmental rallies. Any wavering and you're fired. And it's not just politics either. Elizabeth Gish wrote her doctoral dissertation, The Rhetoric of Sexual Purity in Contemporary Conservative U.S. Christianity, about how some evangelical leaders use body and sexual purity frameworks to control their community. And this idea of purity shapes everything from how you see your relationship with God and the church to who and how you might find a partner or relate to your parents. And there can be specific dress codes and compelled public speech about sexuality that becomes invisible markers of spiritual worth. And leaders reinforce these ideas in sermons, linking impurity to spiritual decay, therefore justifying excluding people from church leadership or even being in a congregation. And it's all a way to preserve authority. If you want to learn more about this, the second season of Shiny Happy People on Amazon Prime is worth a look. And it's not just politics and religion either. Brandon Swedlow's research shows that in science, purity rhetoric shows up as well, as people try to define what kinds of knowledge are legitimate. He looked at a case study of the northern spotted owl controversy, sometimes called the Timber Wars, and this was a major environmental and economic conflict in the Pacific Northwest region of the United States in the late 1980s and 90s. The question was whether that owl was threatened enough to qualify for Endangered Species Act protection, and this was a process that would put people out of work in logging communities. Scientists aligned with the environmentalist view might emphasize objectivity and scientific rigor of their work, framing it as pure science, and criticizing industry-funded research as polluted by economic bias. But scientists who supported the timber industry might highlight the practical implications of their research, portraying it as pure and unbiased by radical environmental agendas. So different groups sought to other scientists with that same purity and contamination language. So you can line it up, right? Orban's nationalism, Trump's personal loyalty tests, Chavez's revolutionary purity, authoritarian purges, church disputes, laboratory disputes. But you see a common architecture. You define the pure, you define what's not pure, and you make sure that the stakes for crossing that line are high enough to scare everyone into staying on your side. So let's switch gears a little bit and talk about highly divisive issues or wedge issues and how those play along nicely. A wedge issue is something that isn't always divisive to begin with, but people can make it one when they spotlight it to create a loyalty test. And when that happens, it puts people in a really tough situation because they feel like they're forced to choose when an issue isn't always a clear choice. When people say things like, if you aren't for us, you're against us, which is an actual quote from a U.S. president, they make it hard to stay neutral. Let's look at a few examples. One from history in the U.S. was the Civil Rights Act of 1964. The president at the time predicted that Democrats would lose the South for a generation by pushing it through, and he was not wrong. Republican strategists used the race as a wedge to split white Southern Democrats from the National Party's civil rights stance by taking advantage of their racial grievances. They made the debate about supporting something they called traditional values. This wasn't just about policy. It reframed racial equality as a purity test. Supporting civil rights meant that you were no longer a real defender of Southern tradition, a frame that made it really hard for Southern Democrats because they could then see that it was a moral choice to leave their party in favor of the tradition of their home. And we can go north of the border to Canada in the early 2000s, when the Conservative Party, led by Stephen Harper at the time, turned a federal gun registry into a powerful political tool. The Conservatives didn't just oppose the gun registry, they campaigned fiercely to abolish it, calling it wasteful and ineffective and a burden on rural gun owners. The Canadian Broadcast Corporation described their strategy as positioning themselves as champions of rural communities, standing against what they portrayed as the overreach of urban elites. So, this wasn't just politics, it was identity. In many rural areas, gun ownership isn't just about hunting or sport, but it's deeply woven into daily life, and some people feel like they need it to feel safe. Opposing that registry quickly became a badge of rural loyalty, a clear sign of solidarity with rural life. But here's where things get tricky, because you had liberal members of parliament, especially those representing rural areas, who had this really tough choice. Because if they voted to support the registry, aligning with their party's broader stance, they risked angering their rural constituents and jeopardizing their chances of getting reelected. But if they voted against it, it meant going against their party, and that might, create internal divisions and weaken the overall party. And conservatives knew this. According to research published in Oxford Academic, they deliberately targeted those cross-pressure voters, effectively weaponizing the registry issue to get an advantage in the election, and it worked. Especially in the run-up to the 2011 election, where the Conservatives successfully turned this wedge issue into tangible gains in the voting. While the gun registry wasn't the only issue that brought victory to the Conservatives, there were broader themes like individual liberty, smaller government, and traditional values, but it definitely did play a key role. And this entire story underscores a deeper enduring divide in Canadian politics, and honestly politics in a lot of other places too, and that is that urban-rural split. Liberals typically find their support concentrated in urban centers, while rural areas tend to be dominated by conservatives. The gun registry didn't create this division, but it certainly amplified it, forcing political parties into really uncomfortable positions, and it strained their unity. In short, the gun registry became more than a policy issue. It was a test of political identity, party loyalty, electoral strategy, and you can kind of see the ramifications of this in Canada's political landscape today. You can see this in other issues as well. The misuse of the term critical race theory to get books out of school libraries, the notion of canceling and the insulting of cancel culture, and more. And in all these cases, the wedge issue sets the stage and the purity test delivers the verdict. I need to take a quick break, but when I come back, we'll look at the role social media plays in all of this. I'll be right back. Welcome back. If political and social movements once had to work hard to create purity tests through mass rallies, print campaigns, or managing party meetings, today the internet has made that process instant and also constant. Online platforms are perfect environments for purity logic. Here's why. They have instant feedback loops, right? Like they have likes and upvotes and shares, and those reward you both immediately and publicly for choosing a side. The whole idea of social media ratio relates to this. And then algorithms also favor the most emotionally charged content. Frequently that's purity-based outrage. And then there's screenshotting. So you can make a single impure comment, and that can be screen captured, and it can be recirculated indefinitely years later. And we're seeing this early and often in the US as the federal government is staffing and reshuffling. Here's another example, Reddit. It's a less popular social network in terms of users, but it's also very active. And it has interest areas such as Ask a Liberal and Conservative, and the moderators are generally volunteers. Studies have found that comments whose political orientation is opposite of those of the moderators are more likely to be removed. This is a form of purity testing, as it effectively filters out those viewpoints that don't align with the dominant ideology of the moderation team. And that's a clear message, right? Disagree on a critical purity point and you're out. It's not even just politics. There's an area called late-stage capitalism, where people critique and make jokes about capitalism. And if you express even mild support for regulated markets or pragmatic transition strategies, you better be prepared to be called a bootlicker or even a class traitor. Here, the purity boundary is ideological. Anti-capitalist positions must be total, and any kind of incrementalism gets you labeled impure. Wikipedia is another really interesting example. You might assume that because there's a commitment to neutrality, there rarely would be editing disputes on Wikipedia, but it's really complicated, actually. Wikipedia has developed something called discretionary sanctions, specifically to deal with disruptive behavior in these kind of heated topic areas, these wedge issue areas. According to The Atlantic, these sanctions are regularly applied in areas like the Israeli-Palestinian conflict, where arguments can quickly escalate, and there's actually even a Wikipedia arbitration committee to deal with issues. Those editing disputes are so frequent and intense that arbitration has led to certain editors being restricted or even in some cases banned. Wikipedia itself has said that these measures target behaviors described as tendentious editing, essentially when editors consistently push a particular viewpoint, which violates Wikipedia's neutral point of view policy. There was an incident this year reported by the Jerusalem Post where 8 editors, 6 seen as pro-Palestinian and 2 as pro-Israel, were banned from editing in this sensitive area. And the arbitration committee linked these bans specifically to problematic conduct, not simply viewpoints. But it does underscore how closely Wikipedia has to monitor and police editing behaviors. But there's an even more complex debate about motivation and morality. The criticism refers to purity issues, suggesting that Wikipedia sometimes focuses not just on what editors are writing, but why they're writing it. Issues like anti-Zionism or other movements have been particularly sensitive, promoting Wikipedia to impose even more restrictions. So recently, for example, the arbitration committee placed limits on canvassing, which is the practice of editors contacting each other privately in order to influence public discussions. They've also introduced balanced editing restrictions, meaning that editors sometimes have to expressly limit their contributions in some hot-button areas. And all of these measures reflect deeper philosophical tensions. So at its core, Wikipedia does aim for neutrality and factual representation. But this Israeli-Palestinian topic starkly reveals how hard it is to maintain this ideal, because the disputes aren't just about facts, they become moral battles over trust and credibility. So who gets to shape knowledge? Who decides what's neutral? Who decides what's biased? And of course, there's also Twitter/X, which illustrates how it's a growing problem. There was a study that was published in Science Advances that found that cognitive distortions, which are things like all or nothing thinking and emotional reasoning in political tweets, it rose 40% between 2016 and 2020. There are state-backed propaganda accounts and domestic disinformation networks that have learned how to drop purity-themed narratives into online communities in order to just break them up. For example, in 2016, Russian troll accounts on Twitter didn't only focus on pushing pro-Trump or anti-Clinton messages, they also tried to inflame tensions between Bernie Sanders supporters and Hillary Clinton supporters, and framing compromised positions as betrayal. And then in Europe, in far-right networks, infiltrators have used purity arguments about nationalism, immigration, and EU membership to drive these wedges between more moderate conservatives and a far-right core. So when you inject a divisive wedge issue into a group and you frame it as a purity test, you produce splits, and a divided enemy is less trouble for you. Or in other words, a country that's battling itself is less likely to battle you. So you can think of it having both human and political costs. So let's talk about 3 levels of cost: psychological effects, social consequences, and political or institutional impacts. At the individual level, the psychological, purity testing often creates an environment of constant self-monitoring. You start running every opinion through a mental filter. Will this make me look bad? Could someone screenshot this and turn it against me? If you've ever deleted a post or hesitated before saying something in a group chat because you weren't sure it would pass someone else's ideological sniff test, you felt this. And honestly, I do this all the time. I think a lot before I post, and I type a lot of posts that I delete. And here's the kicker. Fear of dissent doesn't just silence your public voice, it also blunts your own private critical thinking, because over time, you stop even entertaining alternative perspectives in your own head, just because doing so feels dangerous. And there are social consequences. When you get fear of impurity through a community, you get groupthink. So that's the tendency for everyone to kind of stick with the dominant opinion without critically thinking about it. In political science, there's a related term called affective polarization. And that is not just disagreement over policies, but a really deep dislike and a suspicion of other people. Purity tests take that a step further. They can generate affective polarization inside a movement. Sometimes your opponents aren't on the other side. They're sitting next to you in your party caucus or your online forum. And there's a lot of examples of this. When a politician steps out of line with the party, for example, leadership can threaten to support other candidates in their place. And that can get in the way of representing your own constituents' interests. Finally, There are political institutional aspects, particularly in places with multi-party parliamentary systems. Canada and Western Europe, for example, where these wedge-driven purity conflicts can collapse governing coalitions from the inside. Once a coalition partner is painted as ideologically untrustworthy, that trust goes away and you can't compromise anymore. And that makes it difficult to form a government. When the purity appeals come from the top down, it can hollow out democratic norms. When you define political dissent as moral corruption, a leader creates justification for limiting free speech, for criminalizing legitimate opposition, for example, protests, and they use that to concentrate power. You can see this showing up in things like U.S. legislators speaking out against growing deficit spending, but praising a bill that will increase the deficit because the president championed it, sometimes in the same week. Purity can become a pretext for political violence as well. Immigration's a common topic for this, with government leaders painting immigrants as a threat to the dominant culture to justify not only not obeying laws, but sometimes denying things like due process to immigrants. And once you frame things as a purity issue this way, drastic repression becomes more socially acceptable for people who fear impurity more than they fear injustice. Purity boundaries have a way of tightening. At first, the group may define impurity narrowly. Maybe it's about a single key issue, but once those purges begin, the definition can expand to include more minor deviations. Remember that example from Rwanda where it was whatever the party in charge said it was. Here's another historical example. In Stalin's Soviet Union, early purges targeted high-profile enemies of the people, but over time, that criteria broadened until just a minor policy disagreement or a personal rivalry could be reframed as ideological disloyalty, and that just fueled these endless cycles of fear. Online, this same drift kind of happens in miniature. So you might see a subreddit that once tolerated a lot of strategy debates, and it eventually becomes hostile to anything but total agreement until contributors learn to self-censor or to leave. I need to take another quick break, but when I come back, I'll talk to you about some ways we can get ourselves out of this situation. I'll be right back. Welcome back. So we spent a lot of time today unpacking how purity tests work, why wedge issues make them so potent, and how the internet became the perfect delivery system. But if we stopped there, it would sound like this is an unsolvable problem. And the good news is that it's not. Purity logic thrives in environments where people feel like they have no choice but to prove themselves over and over. The way to break that cycle is to give ourselves and our communities better ways to build trust and to learn how to handle disagreement. Let's talk about some approaches that have been shown to help, and we'll draw from political science and community moderation research and maybe some historical examples. The first, and I think the most underestimated step, is simply noticing a purity test in real time. In political organizing, veteran campaigners are often quick to ask, who benefits from us fighting about this? That question reframes the moment, and it takes the group a chance to identify whether a wedge issue is trying to divide and weaken them. So, for example, during the South African anti-apartheid movement, there were diverse coalitions of labor activists and students and religious leaders, and they disagreed on a lot of things, everything from economic policy to foreign alliances. Some factions tried to reframe these disagreements as moral disloyalty, but leaders like Nelson Mandela successfully held the movement together, in part by explicitly rejecting purity framings and naming them as being divisive, so that helped to keep the focus on the same goals. Online, the same approach works in smaller doses. So for example, a community moderator can post, talking about issues is fine. What we won't accept is questioning commitment to the cause. And that resets the boundary from ideological purity to respectful conduct. You can also build structures that allow for disagreement, or what are called conflict-tolerant structures. These systems allow people to disagree without punishing or humiliating them. Really clear issue-based rules can help with this. So for example, some political subreddits have learned how to separate position-sharing threads from policy brainstorm threads, and they use tags for that, so people know where disagreement's going to be expected. You can also use temporary cooling off bans, and this is more effective than permanent purges in preventing those purity spirals. They signal that the problem is the behavior, not the moral contamination. Next, you can focus on outcome and not stance, because purity tests love posture. The words you say, the hashtags you use, that visible signaling of belonging. But in politics, as in science or activism, it's usually the outcomes that matter. And that means shifting conversations from, do you believe X, to, will this policy improve things and how do we know? I think New Zealand can be a good example of this. They have a really diverse governing coalitions that often spans environmentalists and centrists and indigenous rights advocates. And while ideological divides do exist, a lot of the negotiations remain focused on policy impacts that you can measure. And that lets them get away from some purity traps that could fracture their government. It's not perfect, but it does help. And do know that this approach doesn't mean abandoning your principles. It means measuring commitment is working toward agreed upon goals, not just posting the right hot takes. Remember, democracy is inherently messy. In multi-party systems, coalition governments are the norm, and their survival depends on members not treating every disagreement as a purity failure. Or, as Canadian Prime Minister Wilfrid Laurier once said, the divisions of parties in Canada are artificial. And he was pointing out how shifting alliances could really produce surprising progress. That flexibility is not possible if the parties are captured by purity logic. So for the rest of us, that means training ourselves to see disagreement not as disunity, but as evidence of a system that allows there to be multiple perspectives that work toward a common objective. Or, as I've sometimes seen it said, dissent can be patriotic. So what do you do in your own life? If you feel the itch to test someone's loyalty, ask yourself, am I reacting to the issue or am I reacting to the person? And could we disagree on this and still work together toward a bigger goal we both care about? Now, every group needs boundaries, right? They need rules for conduct, they need shared objectives, they need lines of accountability. But boundaries are about behavior, and purity is about worthiness. Journalist Amanda Ripley has written about complicating the narrative as a tool for reducing conflict. If you add nuance, if you add multiple perspectives and mixed examples, you make it harder for the conversation to collapse into pure and impure binaries. In practice, this could mean we don't allow doxing in this community, which is a clear behavior boundary, rather than people who disagree with our stance on this aren't a part of us, which is a purity test. And if you can get away from this inner-out logic, that's great. If you can't, if the group is just going that way, sometimes the healthiest option is to leave. A lot of people, I think, left X for that reason. Because if every conversation becomes a test of loyalty, and if compromise is treated as sin, there's nothing to be done. And leaving doesn't make you a traitor in that case, it makes you strategic. So, purity feels like conviction. It feels like courage. And sometimes holding a hard line absolutely is the right call. But history and our own online experience show that when purity hardens into a trap, it can hand easy victories to people who benefit when others are fighting among themselves. So here's your challenge. Next time you feel the urge to check someone's ideological bona fides, pause. Ask yourself, am I defending what matters? Or am I narrowing my world until there's almost nothing left? Have a great week, truth seekers, and stay sharp.
Our democracy is hanging by a thread, but we know it's not about just winning and losing each battle. It's about persistence and building resilience.
That's why we're launching the Practivist Pod, the practice of activism made practical.
If you're looking for ways to get engaged or just for ways to stay sane, we want to help you navigate what comes next.
It's an exciting collaboration with political dynamo Jess Craven, author of the Chop Wood, Carry Water newsletter.
And grassroots activist Steve Pearson, host of the How We Win podcast.
Every week on the Practivist Pod, we're going to have important conversations with changemakers, give you practical ways to make an impact, have some fun, and inspire hope.
This is more than a podcast. It's a place for our community to grow our practice of advocacy for justice, equity, and progress.
Action is the best antidote for anxiety, so subscribe to the Practivist Pod today.